Welcome back to the Royal Talens Creator Studio. My name is Jeff Olson, and I'm the Art Education Director for Royal Talens North America. Today we're going to talk about watercolors. And I think the best place to start is the history. At the end, I've got a really cool technique that I want to share with you. I love art history. I call it the long story short. Don't you guys love art history? Extremely condensed history of watercolors. I love art history. And one of the most important things about it, I think, is being able to make a real connection with the artists of the past. So let's start. Our long story short. Did you know that watercolors are one of the oldest materials in use, predating oil paints by thousands of years? The Egyptians used a form of watercolor, relying on mineral-based pigments for painting detailed hieroglyphics on papyrus, dating back to 5000 BC. Images like these, cascading clouds, rugged mountain peaks, and reflective waters of Chinese watercolor paintings had already developed around 4000 BC as a sustained tradition. It took until the 15th century for watercolor painting to develop in Europe. Part of that had to do with the evolution of papermaking. Watercolors and the history of papermaking go hand in hand. The best known watercolors from the Renaissance are Albrecht Dürer's landscapes, still lifes, and studies of animals. His watercolor painting became pivotal in their climb from merely study materials to finished artworks. Watercolor took hold in England during the 18th century, led by artists including Turner, who could often be found painting on plein air with watercolors. In 1781, William and Thomas Reeves are credited with the invention of the watercolor pan, making both the access and use of watercolors easier and available to a broader audience. In the 19th century, watercolor emerged as a medium used by many prominent artists, including Bertha Morisot and Winslow Homer. Modern artists, most notably George O'Keeffe, who is without a doubt probably the most famous American watercolor painter of the 20th century, and other contemporary artists today, like Paula Rego, use watercolor to dramatic effect. That concludes my long story short of the history of watercolors. Now let's get into that new technique I talked about at the beginning. I think you're really going to enjoy it. You're all probably familiar with the technique of sprinkling salt over a wet wash of watercolor. You get some really wonderful texture that way. Essentially the salt lays there and dries and soaks up the color around it and gives you this wonderful granulated texture. What we're going to do, we're going to use some salt as well, but this is what I call a salt water wash, and it's super fun. And I'll show you what we do. First off, just the basic materials. So I got a simple watercolor paper here. This is a 90-pound cold press. I have some basic watercolors. I have the Van Gogh brand, which I really love. You can see I've got them out in the set. I have a couple different spots for each color. One's a little more fluid than the other, added a little more water in other words. I've got two containers of water. One you can see I've already been using here to clean with, and then this is our clean water for the wash. I have a couple brushes. I got a wash, flat wash brush, and then just your basic Princeton round number 12. I also have a measuring cup and salt, which we're going to use. So the first step I want to do is just kind of comparison. So we all have seen the wet into wet technique of wetting the paper first. Don't put too much water, just enough to soak it on. You can see the paper there. You can see how that is right there. Now I'm going to take a little bit of color, just a little bit to begin with, and you can see when you put the wet into wet, you get these wonderful bleed edges. You can also like drop it or flick it in there, and you get these nice blooms. So this is just basic wet into wet. So now we're going to do the salt water. So I've got 12 ounces of water here. I don't know if you can see that real well. I'll make sure I take a picture of it. And for 12 ounces of water, I've got a tablespoon here. And you pour in a tablespoon of salt to 12 ounces. Get it completely dissolved. Just like we did before, we're going to wet the surface. My wash brush here. I want to puddle it up. Just nice even coating. Let's try some red first. Oh yeah, look at that. See how much faster it spreads? And you get these wonderful little tendrils of color. That's fantastic. Let's add a little blue next to it. See what we can get from that. This is a great technique for variegated washes. Making a nice underpainting, for example, to build on. Look at how fantastic, well I love Prussian blue anyways, but look at that fantastic edge you get right there. Let's try a little yellow, see how that works. The water's starting to dry, but you're still getting some of that fantastic blooming on the edge. It's almost like an ink. So yeah, so a little salt water, and you can create some wonderful, wonderful washes, bleeds, and add a little extra dynamic to your watercolor painting. So what does the salt water do exactly? So just like when you're in the ocean swimming, your buoyancy is increased and you float more easily, the same thing's happening here with the pigment. The pigment is floating across the surface of the water and scattering more rapidly. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Royal Talens Creator Studio. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.